I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the nomination of Michael Barr to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Vice Chair for Supervision. His nomination, his confirmation expected today, but we hold votes on these things and find out for sure. His confirmation will mean that the Federal Reserve, for the first time in years, will have a complement of all 7 members. I credit the Biden administration for being aggressive in doing that. I credit the committee which I chair, the presiding officer, as a prominent member of that committee. Senator Warren, thank you for your work on this. It's a big deal. Mr. Barr is a qualified nominee who came out of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee with strong bipartisan support. 5 Republicans, including Ranking Member Toomey, and all 12 Democrats supported his nomination. It's clear why. He's a leading expert with decades of experience helping to guide and protect our economy, including experience with financial institutions and financial regulations. He served this country at the Departments of Treasury and State, as well as at the White House. At the Treasury Department as Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions, Mr. Barr played a critical role in responding to the 2008 financial crisis when Wall Street greed and recklessness crashed our economy. And I know, especially as I said on the floor, what it did to my community, even my neighborhood. The zip code in which Connie and I live in Cleveland, 44105, had more foreclosures in the first half of 2007 than any zip code in America. And we still live with that. We passed Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act back then. Among many steps the legislation took to prevent another crisis, we created the Vice Chair for Supervision to identify and to stay ahead of risks to our country's financial system, cyber threats, volatile cryptocurrency, the climate crisis. We created this job to hold the biggest banks accountable so that Wall Street doesn't put working families and businesses on Main Street at risk. Again, we know Wall Street puts its own interest first always. We know too often it's at the risk of small businesses and the risks of working families and the risks of middle class and the risks of low-income people. We understand that's their behavior. The purpose of Dodd-Frank was as far as we could go to fix that. Mr. Barr's worked for a quarter century to make our financial system safer and fairer. He's focused on developing and evaluating financial regulatory policies. Most importantly, Madam President, he has a keen understanding of the type of risks that pose threats to our financial stability. Mr. Barr will join the Federal Board of Governors at a critical time for our economy, maintaining Federal Reserve independence along the way. In response to a question, for the record, Mr. Barr told us, quote, independence is critical for the Federal Reserve to effectively carry out its congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability. Politics should play no role in setting monetary policy. I'm committed, if confirmed, he wrote, to adhere strictly to a non-political, data-driven, independent approach to policymaking. I support Mr. Barr's nomination in this critical role. Once confirmed, as I said, we'll have a full Federal Reserve Board with all 7 members. It's been almost a decade since we were able to do that. It took this new president and this new majority in the Senate to do that, and I thank all my colleagues that played a role in that. I urge my colleagues to support the nomination of Michael Barr. And Madam President, I ask that the following remarks appear in a separate section of the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I urge my colleagues to support another nominee out of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, Owen Hernstat, who's the nominee to be a member of the Board of Directors of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Like Mr. Barr, Mr. Hernstat received bipartisan support out of the Banking Committee. We now have 4 of the 5 members of the Ex-Im Bank. We will have, after this week, I'm hopeful, 4 of the 5 members of the Export-Import Bank confirmed and in place. We're still waiting for Senator McConnell to tell the White House and offer the 5th nominee, a Republican nominee, so we can fill out that board. Our foreign competitors operate more than 100 export credit agencies and credit programs supporting their manufacturers. China's export finance activity is larger than all of the export credit that G7 countries collectively provide, and China will continue to use export credit to win manufacturing business in critical sectors. I would point out, Madam President, parenthetically, that Under this new leadership in the Senate and new leadership in the White House, for the first time in 20 years, our economy is growing faster than China's. Our GDP growth is actually faster than the People's Republic of China, something we haven't seen in 20 years. Mr. Hernstadt will help lead our nation's official export credit agency as it supports American workers and manufacturers throughout our country. He served some 30 years in senior roles at the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. He served on EXIM's advisory committee. He's more than qualified to join the EXIM board. He'll be a voice for American workers. He understands, as the majority of this Senate does, he understands that we put workers at the center of our economy, workers at the center of our economic policy, workers at the center of policymaking in this institution. The Banking Committee, too often American workers, and Mr. Hernstadt fully understands this, have been forced to compete with unfair foreign competition for far, far too long. The Banking Committee reported his nomination by voice vote twice, last fall and again early this year. He's supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National, again, as a 30-year-long labor activist fighting for workers. He's supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National Association of Manufacturers and other advocates for American businesses and workers. Yet, despite his receiving broad support, a small number of senators continue to oppose anything related to the EXIM Bank, so we're forced to have a cloture vote today on his nomination. Our competitors are not going to stop financing their business sales. We need EXIM to compete, and Mr. Hernstadt is needed on that board to help the EXIM Bank deliver results. He will join EXIM President Rita Jo Lewis, my fellow Ohioan First Vice President Judith Pryor, both Democrats, and EXIM board member and former Congressman Spencer Backus, a Republican from Alabama, who've been working in a bipartisan basis to carry out the mission given by Congress in the 2019 reauthorization to help American exporters compete with China. We know, Madam President, and you've been very engaged in this in your Senate career, we know that bad trade agreements and bad tax policy have led to far too many companies shutting down production in Worcester, Mass. And Worcester, Ohio, and moving overseas and selling those products back into the United States, exploiting cheap labor, exploiting weak environmental laws and weak worker safety laws, but gaining from bad American trade policy and bad American tax policy. EXIM Bank helps us to correct that. So does Brown Wyden, and what we've done and level the playing field in those issues that this new majority in the Senate with this new president have finally decided to enact, making a real difference in not just our balance of trade, but making fundamentally the most important difference, a real difference for American workers who are the most productive in the world. I strongly urge my colleagues to join me in supporting Owen Hernstadt's nomination to the Export-Import Bank Board. Thank you, Madam President. Nice.